Welcome back, everyone, to a Gothic study. This is our companion piece to a Gothic story. We are in our, I guess you can technically call it part 2. I think I said that last time.
Yeah.
Part 2 from the story that you heard an excerpt for, which I think was, the first 2 chapters of The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes.
By Oscar Wilde, which was technically published in 1890. But the novelization version was published in 1891.
Yes.
Also, hi, I'm Quentin.
Hi, I'm Bella.
So, why don't you just... At this point, everyone probably knows what The Picture of Dorian Gray is, because it's a bit more popular than The Castle of Otranto.
That's true.
So why don't you just give us just a little brief rundown of the plot?
Okay. Where to begin? Essentially, an artist by the name of
Basil
paints a picture of a beautiful young man, and this beautiful young man is Dorian Gray.
Yes.
And a man by the name of Henry ends up kind of skewing Dorian's vision of life when he brings to his attention how beautiful he is and makes him realize that, like, he's going to age and everything ages and has a limit. So he basically, like, I guess, like, what would you call what he does?
Grooms him?
Yeah.
Lord Henry definitely grooms Dorian Gray.
He grooms Dorian Gray and basically causes absolute chaos in this young man's life. And it sets him down a path of bad for quite a while.
Yes, because Dorian realizes any ill actions or ill will that he brings onto anyone, any sin, any vice that he partakes in, ends up being, I guess, projected onto the painting.
Yeah.
It gets older, more twisted, more warped, but Dorian remains young.
And this is just incredible power to give to somebody.
Yes, the book ends up going through at least almost 20 years where Dorian has remained the same age he was when the picture was not taken, painted.
Yes.
But he remains the same age, and he just dives deep into all sorts of, I guess you could call it debauchery, especially for late Victorian 1890s. It's quoted as debauchery and sin, but it just, I don't know, modern day party life.
Yeah. Just a man going through his youth for a good 20 years.
The end of the book ends up being Dorian living life to the fullest, but also not finding any meaning in life anymore because he realizes all the pain and suffering he's caused and all of the sins that he's committed is being cast into the painting. He's known that for a while, but it just kind of all bears down on him at once. He takes a knife and stabs the painting, and his servants find him the next morning, him old and decrepit as the painting was in the painting.
Yes.
Back to his youthful nature and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about kind of just the essence of the book.
Yeah. I think the best way to get started with that is to maybe reflect on some of the characters.
Yes.
Tell me, who was your favorite and why?
There's really 3 main characters in the book.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of characters, but there are a good number of characters. But I think just because Basil is always kind of the moral compass, trying to always set Dorian straight, while Lord Henry's always corrupting him, telling him that beauty is everything, beauty's that matters the most, indulge in life's pleasures, and like never just indulge in all the fruits and pleasures of life, because that's what life is about.
Yeah.
Well, Basil always tries to course correct Dorian to a more, not really a pious life, but just a more, is moralistically a word? A morally center life where, you're kind and decent and not screwing people over or partaking in just the large bout of drinking and drug use and opium use.
So you would say Basil's your favorite?
I do, because he's kind of the character we were introduced to first.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of the unsung hero.
Yeah.
Even if he gets taken like several steps behind for the story to focus on Dorian, Lord Henry.
Mm-hmm.
But he's kind of like the hero, even though he ends up getting killed by Dorian halfway through the book. Spoilers, by the way, but I would assume if you're listening to this and watching this, you know what happens.
High probability, yeah. So, personally, my favorite character is actually Lord Henry.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I really enjoy just the chaotic nature of his character. I think he's very poetic.
He is. He is very charismatic. And it's because of that, even though he's morally in the wrong for kind of leading Dorian to this path of vice and literal murder.
Yeah.
Well, you can't hate him.
Because I think he's like the essence of human nature, honestly.
I don't know about that.
I do. I think so. I think
his
human nature just has these like desires and urges, and like Basil's kind of like what we are because of society, and Henry's kind of like what we are behind society.
But for Lord Henry, I feel like all of his philosophy and like views on life were somewhat artificial.
It's extreme and a little artificial, but
because to him it's like beauty is everything. You should never think, because thinking people, intelligent people are ugly.
Right.
And he has that privileged viewpoint because he is wealthy. He is of the upper class. He always partakes in like these dinners and buddying, being nonchalant and interacting with the upper class.
But to a degree, I think that a lot of people actually do share similar.
Oh, I'm sure.
Views to a like lesser extent when you actually sit down and dissect anybody's mind.
You could argue that Lord Henry's vaguely supremacist, maybe not white supremacist.
Right.
But I guess any type of supremacy is white supremacy.
Yeah.
He just has this higher thinking of like, he feels like he's better than everyone else. Mm-hmm. Just the way he talks about other people and the poor and all that. Because I think he mentions early on in the book about like,
there was the whole spiel about what was it?
I don't know if it's directly like it's the poor's fault for being poor, but I think it kind of, it's been a minute since we had read it.
See, but my personal life experience, and I've talked to a bunch of people from a bunch of different backgrounds, I do find that people tend to have this mentality in one way or another, no matter what their background is.
Better and for worse.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like he just kind of encompasses what people don't want to like acknowledge in humanity, all wrapped into one lovely supremacist jerk. But
saying that, I don't think that's like the 100% nature of like what being human is.
I don't think it's the only nature, but I think it's like the side of human nature that tends to be shunned. And I think I can appreciate it being brought forth so heavily in this book.
You admire his tenacity.
I admire
his bluntness.
I just admire that Oscar Wilde put him in the book as such a front-forward character.
Yep.
It was very like, it was just a good commentary on human nature, in my opinion.
And we were talking about this because I have it written down. Oscar Wilde's quote in regards to the book and the characters. He says, Basil Hallward is what I think I am. Lord Henry is what the world thinks me. And Dorian is what I would like to be. Mm. Which is kind of interesting that he says that about Dorian, despite the fact he goes down this terrible path of... I always use vice. It is vice. It's just vice and debauchery.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's what you want to be, Oscar Wilde? But here's the thing.
Yeah.
That's what Oscar Wilde is.
Really? I don't know too much about his past.
Oscar Wilde, during his time, was mainly known as a poet and a playwright.
Yes.
Even before this, his most famous work, which I guess this is technically, you could argue, is maybe not his most famous, but one of his more famous works. Picture of Dorian Gray is also his only novel.
Yes.
He's written a lot of short stories. a lot of essays, a lot of poems.
Right.
But this is the only novel, and he's mainly known for being a playwright.
Mm-hmm.
And after, 1895, I think, is when he produces, or the play is performed of The Importance of Being Earnest, which is like hailed as his greatest achievement as a writer.
Yeah.
It's like his masterpiece. But like Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde also lived a double life because he was a gay man.
Yes.
In the Victorian era, which during that time was a crime.
Mm-hmm.
It was it was a predominantly serious crime. It wouldn't give you like the death penalty or life, but you wouldn't end up being in jail for a good while. I think because Oscar Wilde was put on trial.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that. And he was put in jail for 2 years.
2 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it's just funny that
when was that in relation to this book?
The book was released in 1890.
Yeah.
I think the trial was 1895, right after The Importance of Being Earnest was put on.
Okay, interesting.
And we'll get into the specifics of that in a bit. But I think it's interesting that Oscar says that Dorian is what he would like to be because
looks like it's working.
That's what, I mean, that's maybe he doesn't go too heavily on like the drugs and stuff. And I don't think Oscar Wilde's ever killed anyone.
Right.
But Oscar Wilde has had a pretty promiscuous double life because hiding the fact that he was gay and he had relationships. And this is when it gets to kind of weird territory. I guess we might as well talk about the trial.
Yeah.
So during this time, what's the man's name? Oscar Wilde did have a wife and he did have kids, but I guess you could view him as bisexual.
Okay.
Maybe not fully gay, but at this time, I don't know if the man was his like person on the side and he had divorced his wife. I didn't get too far into his other personal life, just mainly the scandalous stuff,
mm-hmm.
which I think is, what's the word I'm looking for? Appropriate for what
it's
we're
like
talking
pertinent
about.
To everything.
So the man he was, I would just say having a relationship with was Lord Alfred Douglas.
Okay.
And I don't know if it was the opening night of The Importance of Being Earnest, but I think it was when it was running initially. Not Dorian. It's Oscar's basically Dorian. Oscar had a card, like almost a business card, a telegram pinned on his, I guess you could call it his dressing room, but I don't know why he would have a dressing room. It's a Victorian
director's room or writer's room.
That Oscar Wilde partook in sodomy. And in that time, sodomy usually refers to like having sexual acts with an animal, which is...
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. But in regards to this period in time, sodomy was having sexual relationships with the same sex, but with men, which at this point, like I said, was a crime in England.
Was it only with men?
Well, I guess if it was
same sex,
or if it, heaven forbid, with younger minors, kids. Yeah. Oscar Wilde sued him for libel.
Okay. Because
like that's a serious allegation to make someone committing sodomy, especially like I said. I know I'm sounding like a broken record during that time.
Yes.
But the thing about libel is you have to disprove that what is being written isn't true. Well, to prove that, I should point out who was the person who put the card. I completely forgot. It was the Marquis of Queensberry, which was, let me see, Alfred Douglas's father.
Oh.
Yes.
Whoa.
He had speculated that there was more going on between his son and Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
So he wrote that card and pinned it, which is like almost like a public decree, like Martin Luther putting his 91 proclamations on the church. It's like that.
Yeah.
So the Marquis of Queensberry's lawyers hired private investigators to investigate Oscar Wilde. And they did, in fact, find that he was living this double life of being gay. So Oscar Wilde dropped the charges, but it was too late because he was already charged with basically sodomy or having relationships with men.
Mm-hmm.
So what ended up being him trying to sue someone else, he ended up being in the spotlight and being the one who was put on trial.
Yeah.
Now, this is where it gets interesting in regards to Dorian Gray, because Basil confronts Dorian about him hearing rumors and words of him partaking in vices and debauchery. I know I keep saying those two words. I can't think of any other synonyms for it. And like, quote unquote, hanging around younger men, having weird relationships with younger men, basically meaning having sexual relationships with younger men.
Yes.
And kind of grooming them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting that's what Lord Henry ended up doing.
Yeah.
And that's why Oscar Dorian cascaded down this, what's the word? Down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
As it turns out, Oscar Wilde, was, seeing male prostitutes and all that, but come to find out, I don't know if this marks Oscar Wilde as being a predator or even, heaven forbid, pedophile, but he was known to, hang around with younger men, younger than him because he was 39 at the time. But even as far as boys of 16 or younger, which does not paint him in a very good light.
Right.
I don't know if those were ever ended up being fully true, but the age of consent at the time was 16. So in a gruesome legal standpoint, he's in the clear. But in today's world, it's a bit odd.
Yeah.
And I'm rambling on about this because, like I said, Oscar is Dorian. It's not that he would like to be. He is, and it's that interesting theme of putting yourself into one's work.
Yes.
That what Basil was talking about right in the beginning of the book about I can't present this portrait to the public because I put too much of myself into it.
Yeah.
And I think Oscar may have slightly put himself in the book too much.
Right. But see, that's what I admire about the work as a whole. It really does feel like such a reflection of humanity, and I don't think that Oscar is a particularly unique case in having those vices and those different moral dilemmas and such.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to see somebody really open up in a way that just unlocks a door into the mind of somebody, I guess.
And it's interesting because, like I said, it technically came out in 1890 because this originally, all great, for some reason, Victorian works, authors would publish them in chunks in magazines.
Yeah.
They wouldn't really have it a full novel. Would always be in a magazine. It'd always be The Christmas Carol.
It's manga of the 1800s.
It was published in several magazines.
Yeah.
But this one that we're reading is the novelization that Oscar Wilde revised. It's 20 chapters. The original was 13. And what's interesting is that the original publication had a lot more LGBT subtext. And I mean a lot more, extremely overt. Because it could be argued from the text that Basil was romantically in love with Dorian.
Yeah.
In regards to the book, Oscar Wilde changes it to be more of Basil admires the art that he's able to create with Dorian. But in the original publication, it's more of this obsession and this love that Basil has for Dorian.
So let me ask you, slight sidebar, not entirely. When you were reading it, what did you think? even like in the revised version.
The thing
Did
is,
you like pick up on romantic undertones?
it's
there?
still all of that's still there, not as much.
It's still very much something you can feel.
It's like buried, but not completely buried. But the original had a lot more, and I think the reason, I feel like there's two reasons. One was that people liked it, but there's a lot of criticism about like this being a foul, poisonous, impure book because of these undertones. So I wonder if Oscar either changed it so it could be stomached more by a prudish, stuck-up audience that was the Victorian times.
Yeah.
For it to be more digestible and for it to sell better, or he was worried that people would read too much into it and think, what's going on, Oscar? And I'm wondering if he was like kind of trying to save his own neck, because it was published during this time when there was a lot of scandals about people being gay and a lot of stuff being uncovered and just being this immoral thing. So he's like, I'm going to save face and try to cover my own tracks.
Right.
And it's interesting that it's not, I don't think, the magazine edition, but the novel edition would be used as evidence during Oscar Wilde's trial.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
The thing that he put probably too much of himself in, you could argue, ended up kind of becoming his downfall.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it's I don't think the book itself is what caused him to be sent to prison. Hard labor, mind you, for 2 years. I think it's just all of the stuff that the private investigators found.
Yeah.
That kind of sealed his fate.
It's interesting because in the book, art is what was Dorian's downfall. And in real life, art also played a part in Oscar's downfall.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde has a weird philosophy when it comes to art. And it's, I think the term for it is called aestheticism.
Okay.
I think that's how it's pronounced. It's aesthetic. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's the word aesthetics in it.
Yeah.
And I think this was a movement coming about around this time where people were saying that art should be only viewed for the beauty of it and not for anything else. Not for any subtext or undertone. It's the idea of art should just be art.
Okay.
And if anyone, the audience, the critics, looks at it in an analytical way or get something out of it that wasn't purely there, it's mainly the fault of them and not the artist or the art.
And Oscar followed this or did not follow this?
I think he followed this.
Okay.
Because I think this was a movement, maybe not a huge movement, but it was circulating around
a little philosophy in the circles.
And it's, I mean, do you think art should just be based off of art, or do you agree with not in the way Oscar puts it, but in the idea of it should be critiqued and analyzed?
This is actually a conversation I've had with many people. So I believe that if the artist explains that there's a deeper meaning behind the piece, then there is.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe that if the artist has never stated such and has no, record or history of creating art with the intent of deeper meaning, then I do believe that you should take it for just its aesthetic value. So it really is kind of like a case by case for me.
I've always believed in the idea that art is subjective because, I mean, just imagine how like interesting and wonderful and amazing is that you take 10 people in a row and make them look at this painting, whether it be a regular landscape or a portrait or an abstract, and ask them what they feel about it.
Yeah.
And more often than not, they're probably, not all of them, but a good majority is going to give you like a different answer. And I think that there's something powerful and magical that you can look at one painting and think something else to what the person right next to you is thinking.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's inherently wrong.
I don't think it's inherently wrong. I just, like I said, believe it really comes down to the artist's intent with that piece in particular. Because as like an artist myself, some pieces I do feel like I have meaning behind and will explain, and then other things just kind of come together by fate and nature and all that and have no meaning and just are purely for aesthetic. So I have a little bit of both.
I think for something like that, it adheres more to maybe painting than anything else. In like comparison,
I think
like,
it can be for literature and words as well. Yeah,
because I feel like literature is it can be slightly different because there's more to it.
Yeah,
because there's dialogue of the characters and thoughts of the characters and like actions.
There's also how deep you can read into it, because if you read something just for its face value words, it's kind of like looking at a painting and taking it just for like beautiful flower. Whereas like you can also like analyze the words and be like, he wrote in this specific pattern order, these words could allude to this, could reflect on this part of human nature, blah blah blah, and go deep into it. Or you could not do that.
I think Oscar Wilde even puts in the preface that there are good books and there are bad books, and that's it. But I don't even think he agrees with its own philosophy, because art's talked about a lot in the book, and even in the beginning, like when they're out in Basil's garden, he always puts so much description in like the nature of it, and I think that just is backing up the idea of like the importance of beauty in things.
Mm-hmm.
And Oscar Wilde talks about like, you don't read too deeply into a work of art, despite the fact that he's like putting his own philosophy and his own ideals and his own like I said, self into it. And
well, you have to wonder, maybe he did not really view the book as art.
I mean,
maybe he viewed it in more of like a almost like spiritual sense for himself.
But Oscar Wilde wasn't spiritual at that point.
Well, I don't mean spiritual in the traditional sense, but just something of putting himself into something deeply and with great meaning. But
then you would get into the argument of like, what is art? Is a poem an art? Is is a poem a piece of art? Is a book a piece of art? Is something you put on a canvas a piece of art?
Mm-hmm. I guess it really, again, I feel like just is up to the creator to tell us what they feel about their work first, and then we're allowed to interpret it however we want. But I think the creator has ultimate say over their own work and whether they want it to be perceived as art and what type of art they want it to be perceived as, and if there is greater meaning or not. And absolutely, people can interpret things beyond that for themselves. But it's kind of like reading a series or watching like a series or something that was never finished, and everybody might have like
that's the worst.
Their own.
I hate when a show gets
They might have their own like assumptions of what happens at the end, but like only the creator really knows what would happen at the end. Or if the creator says that's it, there was nothing more in the end, then really like it's their story.
And if a creator's
their world
just continually being vague, then all bets are off. Whatever you say, what any audience member, critic, anyone says, it's true. If the artist isn't specifically saying this bowl of fruit is nothing more than a bowl of fruit,
right?
Then like by all means say like this bowl represents his troubled childhood.
Right. Absolutely.
I think the most interesting thing about furthering paralleling, not a word, comparing Oscar Wilde to Dorian Gray is what Oscar Wilde ended up writing when he was in prison. It was, I don't even think you could call it a letter.
Mm-hmm.
People refer to it as a letter. I don't think a manuscript that's 50,000 words long could be described as a letter, but it's called De Profundis or Profundis. Now, I'm an idiot and I didn't try to translate what that meant, but the root word profounds in it, so I'm guessing it's his thoughts.
Yes, that is a logical assumption.
And it's in more or less two parts, I think, or people have divided it into two parts because it talks about his relationship with, what's the man's name? Alfred Douglas. The whole situation and his thoughts upon it. And it's interesting that while in prison, Oscar Wilde becomes more spiritual. than he did. Because before, Oscar Wilde's like main philosophy is live life in pleasure, much like Dorian Gray.
Yes.
Where everything's just superficial, just live the life to, give yourself as much joy and pleasure as possible. And it's interesting that it's the same kind of philosophy that Dorian ends up having through Lord Henry in that evil little yellow book that he's given by Lord Henry.
Yes.
I just think it's interesting that it just further shows that Dorian and Oscar more or less kind of the same thing. And
I think we're digressing though.
In what way?
You were talking about the two parts?
Yeah, it was about his relationship with Douglas and his kind of just mulling over like his time in prison and like what he felt about the whole thing.
Okay.
Yep.
And was that his last work?
I don't believe so. I forget when Oscar Wilde died because he died not long after he was released from prison. I'm sure he wrote a bit more. And so much all the research I've done, I kind of just focused it on.
No, that's understandable.
But talking about his work, I think you can very much tell that I don't know if Oscar Wilde wrote plays before. Again, so much I really know about Oscar Wilde. But you can tell that he has that playwriter's mentality.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of dialogue, especially in like the first two chapters, mainly from Lord Henry. That man likes to monologue.
Oh, he does.
There's just, in comparison to the Castle of Otranto, where there was more descriptive writing.
Yeah.
And this one, it's far more dialogue heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And Lord Henry will just have like a page and a half of him just talking just nonstop, just a brick.
Yeah.
Of like him just spouting on about his philosophy. And you can just very much tell that Oscar Wilde has that playwright mindset because you kind of have to tell a story through dialogue. You can't really do it through asides like a book can with descriptions.
Right.
Everything has to kind of, the story has to flow through the dialogue.
Yeah. So I have one final question that I think would be fun to kind of dissect.
Okay.
How do you think that this book like overall pertains and like adds to like Gothic literature as a genre?
I think in this point in time, Gothic literature was, I guess you could say, maybe not dying out, but like, feel like the hat was being worn out.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you have Castle of Otranto, which was the 1700s up to like Frankenstein in 1818, I think?
Something like that.
Going up to stuff that Jules Verne had done. I think the main crux of Gothic literature really came out around like the 1880s and 1890s because you had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde coming out around this time. Dracula.
Yeah.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's technically Gothic. War of the Worlds, as I guess is technically Gothic. And then you had all of Edgar Allan Poe stuff in the 1850s. I think at this point, people were just getting a bit exhausted of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Because that's like a century almost, more than a century of this type of like melodrama and supernatural things. And
right.
If you do something long enough, people get bored.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this was like the tail end of like the peak, I think, of Gothic literature, where people were just...
Yeah, no, I would agree with that assessment.
And then you have H.P. Lovecraft kind of reviving it, but doing his own thing with cosmic horror in the 19-teens and 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a few decades after. So
yeah,
I think at this point, people... Because it's nothing new that they've seen before. It's all the melodrama, all the supernatural, all the dark twistedness of a Gothic story. I think people were just getting kind of sick of it.
Yeah. So do you have any closing thoughts?
read the book. It's a good book.
It's a great book. I really enjoyed it.
I feel like at this point in like the 21st century, people know about the picture of Dorian Gray and like vaguely about a man who stays young.
It's a pretty staple reference to hear.
Yeah. But I think people just know about the face value of it's about, a man who stays young while his picture ages, but it's a lot more than that. It has a lot to do with human nature and morality.
Yeah. I think it's beautifully written as well.
Yes. Oscar Wilde is nothing but excellent when it comes to writing.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
What are we doing next time?
Carmilla.
Carmilla, yes. And you're doing the audio for that one.
I am doing the audio for that one.
How are you feeling about that?
Everybody's in for something.
Yeah, Carmilla will be interesting because I think that one's a bit more of an obscure one like Castle of Otranto.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into discussion about that though.
And I think it came out around the same time, 17th century, late 18th century or late 1700s. And it's a bit similar to Dorian Gray than what you might think. There's also some gay undertones in it.
Interesting things that you'll have to come back and hear.
Yes. So until next time.
Yes.
I'm Quentin.
And I'm Bella.
And this has been a Gothic study. See you next time.